Hey guys, Jason here with another Duel Masters video. Today I am going to be sharing with you one of my favorite sources of inspiration, Japanese DM blogs. So the one I am on now is called Torekakaku, and these sorts of blogs are not uncommon amongst the Japanese fan base because of how long Duel Masters has been running over there. It's very, it's not uncommon for people to sort of catalog what the relevant decks are from previous years and formats. Now, this is a frequently visited source for me. When I used to make TCG decks, a very common source of inspiration I would look to would be these sorts of Japanese blogs. Now, today I am going to go over some of the early years of Duel Masters, and that is going to start from the very beginning. So I've opened it in a new tab over here, Historical Environment Decks from 2002 to 2010. I'm just going to give some of my thoughts on the decks. I'm going to try to provide some commentary on them. I'll try to not to spend too long on each deck. It'll start off very familiar, and then as we go through the years, well, hopefully some of my DMP and DM wiki knowledge can seep in and I can provide some context. If you're an OCG aficionado, feel free to pitch in the comments as well. So, starting from the very beginning, the very first environment, Theta. This refers to fire, water, nature, aggro style. Looks like this is how they used to build them. There were no speed attackers back then, and they were building around Gatling. So lots of mana ramp, a good amount of draw thanks to Cyberbrain, and also, what's his name? King Riptide, that's right. And nice to see some Ultimate Force there as well. Very interesting. Now on the flip side, we have a more control-oriented build with some blockers, some discard, some destruction, and it looks like the boss creature of choice they have opted to go with is King Depthcon. I guess in other control matchups, he can bypass the blockers, so your opponent isn't wasting your time, and I guess he seemed to be the most appropriate double breaker in here. So there you go. All right. Now moving on to the second environment, so here this is set 2, their equivalent of Evo Crushionators of Doom. We have got a light fire aggro rush type of deck. It's interesting they mentioned second environment because Colon actually came out in the 4th set, at least in the TCG. Not too sure what that's all about, but this is the kind of deck that I think would be pretty fun to make in the TCG especially if you don't have access to a lot of expensive or overpowered cards. I think this is a very cool concept that's quite easy to get off the ground. Of course, the main card that makes this deck work is Divine Machine Armor Valborg, who we have at the bottom here. Think Armored Groblav, but costs 3 mana. You can imagine how much better that is. But I really like these Valborg decks, whether in this flavor or in... Actually, that wasn't a very good transition, but I kind of like this flavor too. So this is kind of like the outlier, but no speed attackers like Pyro and Rikaboo. Instead, you got stuff like Larbagear and more human evolutions. That's pretty cool. This is another kind of deck that I think would be fun in a lower budget environment, though in saying that, lack of access to Valborg and Valdios being a super rare, maybe not. But yeah, I like these kinds of decks. I wonder if we'll come across a water fire version on this blog. Anyway, the next deck we'll cover, this is a very popular archetype. I used to see this a lot in my research. This is Water Nature Aggro. Of course, it's built around Bark Whip, and, well, sometimes you want to play Crystal Lancer too. I think lists in the past that I've seen have been a bit heavier on the Beast Folk, but looks like this one has opted to go strong on the Liquid People. Another curious fact to note is that Aquaguard actually came out in base set in the OCG, whereas in the TCG it came out in set 4. So in case you're wondering why Aquaguard is present for the 2nd edition deck list, that's the reason. He was around since base set. And would you look at that? 4 Terrapits and 3 Lost Soul. The concept of a Lost Soul beat was alive and well even as early as DM's first year. All right. Now, for something a little bit more sophisticated, we aren't, attacking with King Depthcon with this list. Instead, we've got a removal control style deck, and removal control is the term used for, well, old school control decks in the OCG. So we've got Fal here. That's pretty nice. The the finisher of choice is Gatling Sky Terror. I guess it's because they've opted to run fire. It makes sense that they've chosen to use fire here and not in the previous list because, well, I think Burst Shot is the very first board wipe in Duel Masters. So, finally giving incentive for control decks to use fire. And then, we've got the usual suspects, Lost Soul, Crimson Hammer, Death Smoke. Makes enough sense to me. So I guess this deck kind of just like stalls and then tries to attack with Gatling or deck the opponent. Moving on, so looks like we are in Reef Masters era. So Astral Reef is a very strong card in the OCG. Think Astral Warper, but a third of the cost. Being able to play that with Marine Flower and Steam Star, that's a pretty crazy time. Water had an insane amount of power in the early OCG. You just had these crazy draw cards, not just Astral Reef and Cyberbrain, like we talked about earlier, but we've also got this card, I think it's called Streaming Shaper, the one between Aqua Hulkus and Crystal Paladin. If you're running a mono water deck, lets you draw a crap ton of cards basically, and well, this is basically a mono water deck. So yeah, as you can see, water was very much the favorite civ of early Duel Masters, so the Gauntlet's fascination with water is not unfounded. Moving on, it looks like we've got a tournament-winning deck list here, Japan Championship. Regular, I can't quite remember if that refers to the junior division or the open division, but whatever it is, this is a pretty standard deck list, I like to think. So Astral Reef is, it's a very serviceable attacker, so that's why we don't need Bark Whip anymore, and there's an argument to be made. We don't need Crystal Lancer anymore. You just swing early with him, and then Crystal Paladin can help clear the game later. I also noticed we've got 3 cheeky copies of Cursed Totem here, who is basically Cryptic Totem, but does not need to be tapped. I'm sure you can assume, why that would be good. Yeah. All right, Reef Valborg. So it looks like Astral Reef is the reason you would want to pair Valborg with water instead of light. Makes a lot of sense. I guess Valborg just opens up more dimensions for double breakers and fast attackers. Given the insane amount of draw power this list has with Astral Reef and how cheap Valborg costs, I think you'll be able to play him as a speed attacker fairly often, right? Because he costs like 5 mana. Yeah, pretty good, and I assume Searing Wave helps with the other aggro matchups. So from the looks of it, during this era of the game, we're very heavy on the evolution aggro. That seems to be the current flavor. But we are going to move on into something a little bit different. Now, Incarnation Control. So Incarnation refers to Bliss Totem Avatar of Luck, who we see in the bottom right. Now this deck is so crazy, and honestly, it has so many moving pieces. I don't know how they were able to get this to work. Anyway, the way I understand it is, you play Stall with Cutthroat to police the field, with Bloody Skeeto. Ultimately, you want to ramp enough mana to set up your Bliss Totem engine. The way I understand it is you use cards like Mystic Treasure Chest to put cards in your deck into your mana zone for some crazy ramp. You use Mystic Dreamscape, and I apologize if I'm getting the names wrong. Treasure Chest, I think, is the nature one. Dreamscape is the water one. That allows you to retrieve cards from your mana zone. And ultimately, the way this deck kicks into gear is you keep playing Hellslash to mill your opponent, and then you can use Bliss Totem's tap ability to put Hellslash back into your mana zone, and then you can fish it out with Mystic Dreamscape or Thrash Crawler. And then it's very convoluted, but you just keep doing that until you win. This deck looks very sweaty. Right, now, speaking of sweaty decks, well, actually, this deck's not too sweaty. Actually, I don't know. I guess it is because it says library out, which is a code for deck out. This is a tribal Starlight Tree deck, pretty wild. Use Petrova to power up your blockers, and then Aquan to draw cards. And, well, I guess while your opponent is dealing with your blockers, you're playing obnoxious cards like Skeleton Vice, Slash Charger, and Hellslash. So this deck does not look like a good time. For the record, I've always felt that 1 or 2 copies of Diamond Cutter was a very good fit for these sorts of 3-color decks, or decks that were just heavy on guardians or blockers in general. There are a couple of our Season 2 and 3 decks that I think could benefit from Diamond Cutter. I digress though, so yeah, this is an early Aquan list from the looks of it. Alright, now before we close off this video, I guess it would be good to cover the tail end of the TCG era. So in 2004, I think, is when we got Shockwaves of the Shattered Rainbow, or I should say is when Japan got Set 10. Now this is a deck out list that I think we will all be very familiar with. When we made our deck out decks for Seasons 2 and 3, they were very much patterned on these sorts of lists. I think it's pretty straightforward. No, nothing too crazy in here. And Slash Charger is still at 4. And oh yeah, right, it says here Lost Charger 4-card era. But we'll see later how these sorts of decks evolved when Slash Charger was eventually Hall of Famed. Elimination Control. So it says 2014 here. I think this is a typo for 2004. Now this is another deck out deck. I think you can see that you just be super annoying, you just spam blockers, you play Miraculous Snare, you disrupt your opponent. And between medium-sized blockers and Nariel, I think that combination can be pretty hard for a lot of decks to get through, especially with Palolesis boosting the power. Aquan is there to act as the engine, and you got the usual darkness suspects. Pretty low in the fire section though. I guess this dude has opted to use light to stop the opponent's attacks rather than fire. Alright, now this is a very interesting deck, Dragon Control. Maybe this is how we should be building #RubGang. So the way this deck works, I guess it plays a crap ton of Chargers, and then it uses a lot of Velerica and a bunch of other cool dragons too. It's interesting because Duel Masters USA several years ago covered a Rub deck that put a lot of emphasis on Velerica because it's a +1, right? It's a big body that gives you a +1. Seems pretty good. And this guy has taken that concept to the limit. So if this is something that you want to try out in the TCG, I think it would be really cool to look at for sure. How would it hold up? I don't know, but I don't think we've seen anything quite like this in a competitive TCG setting. So I like it very much. Right, now we've got Aquan Black. So I guess the logic here is you just use a lot of weenies that can sort of generate advantage, and Aquan's the engine for that. Well, you got your water to draw cards, and then your dark to do darkness things. This looks like a meme deck. I think versions with Petrova are just strictly better than Shadow Moon. Sorry. Now, I may have to eat my words because there is another Aquan Black deck that uses Hydro Hurricane. So Hydro Hurricane has been a card that has been very successful in the TCG setting for these past couple of years. Yeah, so I guess the logic behind this deck is you fill the board with your Darkness Weenies, which have decent effects when they attack. And while Hydro Hurricane can clear your opponent's board in one go, I guess if you have Snake Attack, you want to build up a board, you can also win off that. This deck is very interesting. It seems kind of fragile. Haven't tested though, so can't say for sure. But yeah, you love to see it, right? Hydro Hurricane and Snake Attack being used as finishers. All right, here's a list that I think we can get more on board with. So this is Aquan Guardian. I guess think Marinomancer Guardian. Actually, Marinomancer Guardian is something that it's not really a thing in the TCG. We always played with Initiates. But in the OCG, this sort of thing was fairly common. You've got a lot of cheap Guardians to flood the board and to evolve into things. Petrova, obvious synergy there. I always feel really sad that we never got Aquan or even DMP Aquan in the TCG because I really like the synergy between Aquan and Petrova. You play Aquan, you draw a bunch of cards, hopefully you find your Petrova, which you can play the following turn. And then of course between turns 2 and 3, you can play your tribal weenies, right? The card we have at the bottom here next to Terrapit is Dark Hydra Evil Planet Lord. It is an insane card. When you put him into the battle zone, when you put a creature into the battle zone, You can choose a creature with that same race in your graveyard and put it into your hand. So given the amount of weenies we have, I think you can see how crazy that ends up being. And, even without that crazy interaction and those potential unlimited resource situations, the fact that Dark Hydra can grab himself is really good because you'll be able to +1 off him when you play him. I don't want to say pretty often, but some of the time. And he's a boss. He's a double breaker. Pretty good. Survivors. So this is I don't want to say it's a primitive survivor list. I guess it's a list without soul swap. By and large, I do agree with the card choices. They're playing all the usual suspects. Skull Sweep, I don't think is that good. The one Giggling I don't think is that good either, but I certainly understand it. But yeah, you just play a ramp, you build around Factory and Graveworm, and boom, good things happen, I guess. Yeah, not too sure what else to say, but if you're playing Survivors without Soul Swap, this is a pretty reasonable list. All right, next we've got the outlier, the true outlier. So Firelight Rush. Now here, this deck is supposed to have been a top placer in the 2004 Japanese Championships, or a big Japanese tournament at the very least. But I think that is not technically true, or at least it's not 100% true, because I know Fanu came out in DM13, which came out in 2005. So what I suspect is that a very similar list within the archetype placed very well at that tournament in 2004, but the player base kind of just agreed that this list that you see here was the optimized list, and that's what is advertised. Or I could just be full of crap. Maybe Fanu was like a pre-release card. It came out in 2004, and that's the reality. I don't know. But yeah, this is a very common list. Ohinata Rush. You'll see this quite often when you browse the Japanese resources. Alrighty, next up, we've got Turbo Mobius. So this refers to, oh dear, I forget the name. It's called Mobius Charger in Japan. But basically, it's the card next to Mana Nexus. And what it does is it lets you put one of your own creatures in the battle zone, from the battle zone rather, into your mana zone. And then it itself is a charger. Mulch Charger, that was the name. So what the whole idea behind this deck is you want to play Marine Flower on 1, you want to play Astral Reef on 2, draw a bunch of cards, and then on the following turn, you don't attack with Astral Reef. Instead, you Mulch Charger it, which puts you on 6 mana, and then the following turn, you can play Bolmedius or Lost Soul or whatever powerful 7-drop you like. So it's pretty crazy. Yeah, so I thought this is a really interesting and funny concept. All right, Bombazar Blue. So this is a deck that really dominated 2004. Kind of what you'd expect. There are going to be a lot of Bombazar lists in this article just because of how dominant that card was over the game. Being able to pair it with Curse Totem was also super crazy. If you're able to somehow play both of them on the same turn, I think you basically win. Though keep in mind you do have to play Bombazar first. Another alternative is you can build up a board, you play Bombazar, and then you just bring in like Curse Totem the next turn. Maybe Soul Swap in a Twin Cannon or something. Your opponent cannot play Trigs, and that's that. So yeah, Bombazar Blue. I don't think you need me to explain how that works. Here's another Bombazar Blue list, this time with Gonta and Judgment of the Flame Spear and Water's Blade, so one of our favorite cards for Season 3. Pretty straightforward, you do a lot of ramping in the early turns. You got Pyro as a backup attacker instead of Twin Cannon. I guess the rationale behind that is, it's a lot easier to get him live. You just need 3 mana. It's not like, Twin Cannon, which you can play with 3 mana with Soul Swap, but then you need a creature and Twin Cannon in your mana zone. This one is pretty low drama. You just play a bunch of good stuffs cards that work pretty well together. Alrighty. Next, we've got Balval Steroids. So I believe steroids is a term they used to refer to fire, nature, aggro / rush, or, whatever. I think rush is a subset of aggro, so I feel comfortable saying aggro. So what this does is it foregoes the steadiness and versatility of water, and we go in on the speed. So we got stuff like Rickaboos Screwdriver to get rid of blockers. Shaman Broccoli is an attacker that can also ramp mana if it dies. Cavern Raider I think is a little bit sus, but whatever, I'll allow it if we're supposed to be attacking every turn. Maybe turn 4, you play Volcano Charger, you ramp some mana, you attack with Cavern Raider, you find something good from your deck. Yeah, so I quite like the idea of a non-Fire Nature Rush, Fire Nature aggro build. I think this sort of thing is pretty cool. Alright, so moving into some familiar territory, we've got Elimination Initiate. So Aquan is being played with Initiate. You guys know the drill by now. You've seen many Merino decks in the TCG. Of course, we've got some OCG favorites like Dark Hydra in here. The one Estel I think is a pretty cool addition because it's shield regeneration, which this deck otherwise never gets, and it can also evolve. The Glyce Magiculas are interesting. I tested a version with, I tested a Merino build, a Merino Initiates build with Glyce Magicula several years ago, and that didn't work out so well. But I guess you could argue that it's a different environment because you're trying to fight Bombazar, so Glyce being able to stop Bombazar, and Bombazar's attack by discarding cards, maybe that comes in handy, and Aquan drawing you up to 5 instead of up to 3 like in the TCG. I imagine that also makes a pretty big difference with the Glyce synergy. Also cool to see Melee in here. Yeah. Here's another build, Initiates Aquan, this time playing some Slash Chargers and Damien's Boy Photoside. Curiously, it also plays Miss Rias as an alternate draw source, but hey, makes sense. We play Aqua Hulkus in our version, so yeah, why not draw more cards with Miss Rias, right? Especially since it curves off Aquan and doesn't have to compete with Aquan. Next up, we've got some Warlord Elzonius. This is a very different take on Warlord Elzonius compared to what we're used to seeing in the TCG. If you take a look at this, it's very much patterned off the deck out build, except it has Elzonius as an alternate win condition. I'm not too sure why it's built this way, but maybe there's some inherent synergy in there. Now, one thing I will say is I think Elzonius is a really versatile card. Light water aggro is certainly one way to play it, but I think, because of how good it is as a finisher and how good gladiators fit or jive with the control play style, I can totally see Elzonius as a finisher in a control deck. So maybe he's just there to police the field, maybe he's there as the main win condition, maybe he's there as an alternative win condition. I don't know for sure, but it's certainly interesting, and this is a list that I feel like I could have some fun with, even though it is dirty deck out with Slash and Miraculous Snare, both at 4. Anyway, that brings me to the end of the video. This was pretty long. In the next version, I'm going to cover, decks from subsequent years. But yeah, that's all for now, so I'll catch you guys in the next one.